My name is Margaret Thompson, but everyone here calls me Maggie, 87 years old, and I've been living at Sunset Manor Nursing Home, Cedar Falls, Iowa, for 3 years now. 3 long years that feel like a lifetime. Though I suppose when you've lived as long as I have, time takes on a different meaning altogether. I sit by this window, watching the seasons change outside while I remain frozen in this, trapped in a body that no longer obeys my mind's commands. The maple tree beyond the parking lot has become my calendar. I've watched it bloom with spring's tender green, flourish in summer's deep emerald, blaze with autumn's fire, and stand naked against winter's gray sky. 3 times now, 3 cycles of life while I remain here, withering like a forgotten flower pressed between pages of someone else's book. You believe that miracles still happen? Or if you've ever experienced something that deeply touched your faith, share your story in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so we can continue walking this journey of faith together. The hallways of Sunset Manor echo with the sound of squeaking wheels, shuffling, occasional call for help that goes unanswered for too long. The walls are painted tearful yellow that's supposed to be up, but to me it looks sunflower petal. The smell is always this, like hope slowly leaking. I used to be someone I was a high school ink 42 years, shaping young minds, dreams. I was a wife to, I was a mother to, who once thought I hung the moon and stars in the dust for them. I was a grandmother to 7 precious souls who would beg me to read them stories and bake them cookies with too much chocolate. Just room 230, the old lady who cries too much and needs help getting to the bathroom. I'm the woman whose family visits on major holidays and birthdays, staying just long enough to ease their guilt before rushing back to their important lives. I'm the ghost of who I used to be, haunting a body that's become my prison. My daughter Susan, 20 minutes away, but she might as well be on another planet. She has her real estate business, her husband's demanding job, her teenagers with their endless activities and drama. When she does visit, she sits on the edge of the uncomfortable chair beside my bed, checking her phone every few minutes, making small talk about the weather and the store. She never asks what I really to feel like I'm to be seen as more than a burden, to have someone remember the woman I. My son Michael moved to Phoenix after his divorce, claiming he needed a fresh start. His fresh start apparently include regular calls to his mother. I get a birthday card and a Christmas card each year, both bought at the last minute from a gas station, signed with just his name in hurried handwriting. No personal message, no "I love you," just Michael scrawled across the bottom of generic sentiments. Then there's my youngest, David, who was always my baby. He's doing well in his career, married to a lovely woman named Jennifer, with 2 beautiful children. But they live their lives at breakneck speed, scheduling family time like business meetings. The grandchildren who once climbed into my lap to hear stories about princesses and brave knights now barely look up from their devices when they visit. I've become background noise in their lives, furniture they've grown accustomed to ignoring. The staff here is kind enough, I suppose. The nurses and aides do their jobs with professional efficiency, some with genuine warmth. There's Maria, who always takes an extra moment to fluff my pillows just right, and Kevin, the young orderly who tells me jokes while he helps me with my physical therapy. But even their kindness feels borrowed, temporary. They care for me because they're paid to, not because I mean something to them personally. At night, the fluorescent lights dim and the hallway chatter I lie in a narrow bed. I remember Harold's laugh echoing through our little house on Elm Street. I remember the chaos of children were small, wrapping paper lying like confetti, while excited voices filled the corner of our home. The smell of my kitchen when I Sunday dinner for the whole family, roast beef and mashed potatoes, green bean casserole, and apple pie cooling on the windowsill. Those memories are both a blessing. They warm me like sunlight on a spring morning. But they also remind me of how far I've fallen, how much I've lost, center of a bustling, loving family. Now I'm a spoke that's broken off from the left behind while everyone keeps rolling forward, just the absence of fair adult life. Now I'm the one who needs, and I can feel how much I've become a burden to everyone around me. The weight of being necessary is pressing down on my chest. Times the realization that I was crept up on me like fog rolling in. At first, I told myself that they'd find more time for visits. I made missed calls and forgotten promises, clinging to the hope that this isolation temporary stretched into months, and months into shorter and less frequent. The phone calls turned into text message and into nothing at all for weeks at a time. I found myself marking days on a mental calendar not by anything I was looking forward to, but by how long it had been since I'd heard a familiar voice say my name with love. The breaking point came last Christmas. Susan had promised to bring the whole family for Christmas dinner in the Manor's dining room. She'd made such a big deal about it, assuring me that everyone would be there. Even Michael was supposed to fly in from. I spent weeks looking forward to it, telling the other residents Christmas morning arrived gray and cold, with snow swirling outside my old televisions. I got up early, well, as early as my arthritic joints would allow, asked Maria to help me put on my best dress. The navy blue one with tiny pearl buttons that Harold had bought me for our 40th anniversary. I did my hair as best I could with shaking hands, even put on a little lipstick, wanting to look nice for my family. The dining room was decorated with poinsettias and tinsel garland that caught the fluorescent light and scattered it across the walls like broken dreams. I sat at the table they'd reserved for us, checking the clock on the wall every few minutes. 12 o'clock came and went. 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock. Other families filled the room with laughter and chatter, children running between tables while grandparents beamed with joy. At 3:30, my phone finally rang. It was Susan, calling from her car with road noise in the background. "So sorry, the weather's gotten really bad and Jennifer's mother had a fall this morning. We're at the hospital with her. I know we promised, but we just make it today." I sat there in my best dress, at a table set for 8, surrounded by the sounds of other families celebrating, and felt something inside me break. Not break like a bone that heals stronger, but break like glass. Sharp pieces scattered everywhere, impossible to put back together the same way. "I understand, sweetheart," self say, my voice sounding hollow and far away. "These things happen. Mother okay? Oh, she'll be fine. Just a broken hip. These things are. Family has to be there." The words echoed in my mind long after Susan hung. Yes, I thought, family have to be there. But apparently, I wasn't family anymore. I was an obligation, and obligations get postponed when something more important comes up. The staff was kind about it. They boxed up the extra food and helped me back to my room, where I sat by the window and watched snow cover the parking lot like a white blanket, hiding all the ugly things underneath. I took off my good dress and hung it back in the closet, wondering when I'd have reason to wear it again. That night, I called David. His voicemail picked up immediately. It didn't even ring. "Hi, this is David. I'm probably chasing kids or fixing something that broke. Leave a message and I'll get back to you." But he didn't get back to me. Not that day, not the next day, not ever. The days after Christmas blurred together like watercolors. I stopped getting dressed up for visits that never. I stopped sharing stories about my children with the other residents, tired of making excuses for their absence. I stopped checking the clock when mealtime arrived, no longer expecting phone calls that would brighten my day. To understand that being lonely, children were at school, quiet hours of evening, that your existence had become so small and insignificant that you could disappear entirely and it would take days for an. I started having conversations with Harold in my mind, imagining what he would say about our children's behavior. "Love you, Maggie," I could hear him saying in that they're just caught up in their own lives. It doesn't mean they don't care. But even imaginary, feeding on every missed call, every broken promise, every day that passed without a single person asking how I was. The other resident, Mrs. Patterson from across the hall, started inviting me to play bridge, but I couldn't concentrate on cards when mining with questions that had no good answer. Where did I go wrong as a mother? How did I raise children who could abandon me so easily? What did I do to serve this slow into irrelevance? My health began to suffer along with my spirit. I stopped eating, losing all taste, night hours stretched, not with the love and comfort, but with the gratitude that I'd become a burden too heavy, the people I'd devoted my life to care. The nursing staff started monitoring me more closely, concerned about my weight loss and isolation. Dr. Hamilton prescribed antidepressants. But how do you medicate a broken heart? How do you cure the disease feeling forgotten by the people supposed to love you most? Spring arrived early that year, melting the new life emerged, except within the walls of this. The maple tree began to bud again, preparing while I remained frozen and dramatic. There were no sudden cries or explosives. Instead, it was like sinking slow, each day pulling me where hope used to live. By the time spring, I had stopped trying to climb out. The effort seemed pointless when no one was reaching down to help me. My daily routine became movements designed to get me from. I'd wake up to the sound of breakfast carts rattling down the hallway, their wheels squeaking the same protest they'd squeaked yesterday and would squeak tomorrow. I'd let Maria help me get dressed, no longer caring which clothes I wore or how my hair looked. What was the point of the dining room theater of other people's happiness? I'd sit at my assigned table, the small one by the window that was reserved for residents who ate alone, and watch families visit their loved ones at the larger table. I'd see grandchildren showing off school projects, daughters updating their mothers on neighborhood gossip, sons holding their fathers' hands while discussing the weather or last night's baseball game. I became a student of loneliness, cataloging all the ways it manifests faces around me. There was Mrs. Chen, whose son lived in California and called every Sunday at exactly 3 o'clock, but never for more than 5 minutes. There was Mr. Rodriguez, whose daughter brought his great-grandchildren once a month. but spent the entire visit taking social media instead of actually talking to him. And there was Mrs. Williams, whose family visited religiously every week, but spoke to her like she was a child who couldn't understand adult conversation. At least they were still visible to the people who shared their blood, envied their predictable disappointments because my own disappointment becomes so rare. You can't be disappointed when you've stopped expecting anything at all. The activities director, a cheerful woman named Rebecca who wore bright cardigans and spoke an exclamation point, kept trying to engage me. Maggie, we're having a craft session this afternoon. We're making friendship bracelets. Or, Maggie, it's movie night. We're watching The Sound of Music, your favorite. But nothing was my favorite anymore. Colors had faded to gray, music had become noise, and friendship felt like a concept I'd never fully I stopped going to the activity. I stopped participating in physical therapy sessions. I stopped making small talk with the staff beyond basic pleasantry. What was the point of staying engaged with life when life had clearly moved on without me? I was like a ghost haunting the halls of Sunset Manor, visible but not really there, taking up space but not filling it with the isolation did strange things to my I'd find myself having weren't there. Not just Harold, but my children as they used to when they were young and still needed. I'd lecture empty chairs about the importance of reading good books, or explain to invisible students why Shakespeare's sonnets still mattered in the modern world. Sometimes I'd catch myself mid-conversation, wonder if I was losing my sanity along with everything else. Sleep be only escape, and that was unreliable. I'd lie in my narrow bed, listening to the sounds of the building settling around, the hum of fluorescent lights, the distant murmur of the night shift staff, the occasional cry from someone having a nightmare. The darkness felt heavy, pressing down on me like a blanket made of all my accumulated sorrows. It was during those sleepless hours that the worst thoughts would come. Stopped eating, stopped partake of living when I... Would anyone notice right away, or would it take days for someone to realize that Margaret finally given up the fight? These weren't active plans. I wasn't suicidal in any clinical sense, but I was soul tired in a way that made breathing feel like work, opening my eyes each feel like punishment for watching other people's lives continue while mine had somehow stopped mattering to anyone, including myself. The worst part was the guilt that accompanied my despair. I knew I should be grateful. I had a roof over my head, medical care when I needed it. Many people my age were struggling with poverty, or homelessness, or serious illness. Who was I to complain about loneliness when my basic needs were met? But knowing I should feel grateful made me feel worse about my inner purpose in it. I stopped calling my children altogether. If they wanted to talk to me, they knew my number. They cared about how I was doing. They could make the effort to find out, being the one who reached out first. Tired of making excuses for their silence, tired of pretending that their brief, obligatory conversation was vast empty. The staff began treating not uncurved for residents. They'd speak more slowly, not understand. They'd check on me more, monitoring my mental state along with my physical health. The concern but it was not the kind you show to people you love. By August, I had become everything I'd once feared. Invisible, irrelevant, a burden to be managed rather than a person to be cherished. The woman who had once commanded a classroom full of teenagers, who had raised 3 children and buried a beloved husband, who had been the center of family gatherings and holiday celebrations, had been reduced to a problem to be solved or, failing that, I spent hours staring out my window at that maple, now thick with leaves that rustled in the breeze like whispered stories of all the seasons they'd witnessed, all the people who had passages they'd observed from their stationary vigil. Did they long for or lovers carved a tree had become the one living thing that seemed to my existence day after day. When the wind blew waving at me, leaves rustled, tell me something. It was a foolish fantasy, but it was the only thing that made me less alone. October arrived with seemed to seep through the walls of sun to my bones. The maple tree outside my window beginning its annual leaves shifting. I watched them fall one, carried away by the wind and felt an to death. It had been 6 months since I'd spoken to 6 months silence so I could the phone in my room had been a black plaque longer happened. Sometimes I'd stare at it for hours, imagining what I would say if one of my children suddenly decided to check on their mother. But the phone remained stubbornly silent, as reliable in its silence as it had once been in me to the people I loved. My health was declining along with my spirit. Dr. Hampton had started using words like concerning and monitoring closely during his visits. My blood pressure was too high, my appetite too low, my engagement with life too minimal to be considered normal aging. The nurses were talking about adjusting my medications, scheduling more frequent checkups, possibly moving me to the skilled nursing wing where they could watch me more carefully. I didn't care. Let them move me wherever they want, adjust whatever they thought needed adjusting. I was beyond caring about my body when my already stopped working. What was the point of maintaining a vessel when the soul had withered to nothing? The other residents had stopped trying to include me in their conversations. Mrs. Patterson no longer invited me to play bridge. Mr. Johnson didn't ask me to join him for walks in the courtyard. Even sweet Mrs. Chen, who had always smiled and waved when she passed my door, now just nodded politely and kept walking. I had become the kind of others avoid, not because I was unpleasant, but because my sadness was contagious. And who wanted to catch that kind of despair? It was on a particularly gray Thursday in late October that I reached what I would later recognize as my absolute lowest point. I had spent the morning sitting by my window, watching leaves spiral down from the maple tree, and seemed deliberately mocking. Look how gracefully we can let go. They seemed to be saying, look how beautiful the end of our time. I hadn't eaten breakfast. The smell of scrambled eggs made me nauseated, and the effort of lip to my mouth felt impossible. I hadn't showered in 3 days because standing in the bathroom felt like climbing. And what was the point when no one was coming anyway? Around noon, Rebecca, the activities director, knocked on my door. She was holding a clipboard and wearing her usual cheerful expression. I could see the concern lurking behind her smile. "Hi, Maggie," she said with forced brightness. "I wanted to check on you. Maria mentioned that you've been spending a lot of time in your room lately." I looked at her without speaking. What was there to say? That I was dying a little more each day? That I had become a ghost haunting my own life? That I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt truly happy about anything. "We're having a special program this afternoon," she continued, consulting her clipboard. "A local high school choir is coming to perform Halloween songs. I thought you might enjoy that." Being a former teacher and all, like a physical yes, I had been a teacher. I'd been many. What was I now? "I don't think so," I managed to say, my voice coming out as bare. Rebecca's smile faltered for just a moment before she rallied. "You feeling okay? Do you need me to call the nurse?" "I'm fine," I lied. "I was tired." She lingered in the doorway for a moment, clearly wanting to say something else, but not knowing what. Finally, she nodded and left, closing the door softly behind. The click of the latch sounded final, like the last page of a book being. That evening, sunset early, I made a decision to stop pretending it might get better. I was going to stop hoping for phone calls that would visits that would never happen, conversation never take place, to accept that this room, this endless parade of days that stretched. I was going to stop fighting myself sink to the bottom where that night. I just pulled the thin blanket over my clothes and lay there in the darkness, listening to the building settle around me. Somewhere down the hall, I could hear Mrs. Chen coughing, a wet, rattling sound that spoke of lungs giving up the fight. In the next room, in his sleep, having conversation with his past who came to visit him if not in waking life. Like photographs left too long in sunlight, the color's bleakest outlines were. For the first, I understood what it meant to give up hope through Harold's cancer, through the challenges of raising through the normal struggles of everyday life. But hope requires fuel, and mine had finally run out. I was operating on a destination I couldn't see, and no longer. Darkness felt not just the absence of, but the absence of everything that makes life worth living. I was alone in a way that went beyond. I was untethered. As I lay there and surrounded by the I whispered into the darkness, "Do this anymore. I just can't." After what I would later think of as my surrender to something strange. I woke up not to the usual sounds of breakfast carts and morning. It wouldn't have been this thing to happen to my, confirming that my ears still worked. I looked toward my and saw that it had snowed during the wet snow, but the first delicate thin white veil. The maple tree, its nearly bare branches outlined in dean white like calligraphy, gray sky. Beautiful and thing for so long, it now felt like just forgotten I possessed. Sunset Manor hummed with staff conversations, vision programs, the shuffle of walkers and wheelchairs, the distant sound of someone calling for help, or the world felt hushed, expectant. It were holding its breath and waiting for something important to happen. Should have been upset about the snow. Winter meant fewer opportunities for fresh air, longer stretches of confinement, the seasonal depression that afflicted so many residents, where artificial light replaced sunshine for months at a time. Instead, I found myself feeling something I couldn't quite name exactly, but a kind of suspended quiet that felt different of my despair. When Maria came to help me get dressed, I moved more quietly than usual, speaking in soft tones about the unexpected snowfall and how pretty everything looked outside. She didn't push me to get up when I continued lying in bed after she'd laid out my clothes. Instead, she just adjusted my pillows and said, "Take your time, Miss Maggie. Sometimes we all need to rest a little longer." I spent the morning watching the snow continue to fall, each flake visible against the gray sky like tiny dancers performing for an audience of. Found myself following individuals with my eyes, trying to predict where they would land, watching them join the growing accumulation on the window ledge. It was a pointless activity, but it was the first time in months that I'd felt anything happening outside my own internal misery. Around mid-morning, something made me look away from the window and toward my nightstand. There, next to my water glass and the basket of medication rarely bothered to take on schedule anymore, was my old Bible. I hadn't noted maybe months. It had been a gift from Harold on our wedding day, a leather-bound King James version with Margaret Eleanor Patterson Thompson embossed in gold letters on the cover. Couldn't remember the last time I'd opened it. Reading had become difficult as my eyesight worsened. And besides, comfort could those ancient words offer to a woman who felt in by both God, but something about seeing it there, as if it had appeared, made me fingers. The leather was worn smooth from years of handling, and the gold lettering had mostly worn away, but I could still make out the faint impression of my name. I let the book fall open randomly, not looking for any particular passage, just letting that had once provided so much comfort. The pages opened to Psalm 20, and my eyes fell on verse 10. When my father and my mother, then the Lord will take me up. To leap off the page, I read them again and again, feeling something stirred, not hoping, but recognition, as if these words had been waiting patiently for me to find them closed the Bible carefully and set it back on the night. I couldn't stop thinking about those words. Father and mother first. What about whenever you've loved and sacrificed for turns away? That afternoon, I had my first, not one of my children, Mrs. Patterson, from across the hall. She knocked softly and entered when I called out, carrying 2 cups of tea from the. I hope you don't mind the company. I was feeling a bit lonely today. I thought maybe you might be too. I accepted the tea gratefully, surprised by how good it felt to hold something warm in my. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, both of us looking out at the snow that continued to fall steadily, transforming the world into. You know, Mrs. Patterson said eventually, thinking about my daughter lately. She lives in Oregon now, has her own family, her own life. Sometimes I get angry that she doesn't call more often, doesn't visit more frequently, but then I remember that I raised her own happiness. Maybe the fact that she's living her life fully, even without me, did my job as a mother, so focused on activities and social events. I hadn't realized she struggled with feelings of abandonment. Does that make it easier? I asked, my voice rusty. She smiled sadly. Not really. It still hurts. The feeling like a failure can feel like, well, like maybe I succeed too well. We finished our tea in thoughtful silence. After she left, I raised my children. Had I been her own 2 feet, that I'd failed to looking back, of remember came from. That evening, I ate dinner for the not because I was hungry. Opened the Bible again. I'm deliberately. I read about valleys, about God's love and about being future stretched ahead bright with weren't promises or quick fix. They were something else. Acknowledgments of, but also whispers of suggestion drifted off to sleep. Found myself thinking not about my children's absence, but about Mrs. Patterson's about Maria, about the beauty of the snow cup, about word my nightstand, at exactly the moment when I needed to read them. Time in months, the next few days passed in a strange, as if the world had shifted slightly on its axis and was still finding its new equilibrium. The snow had stopped falling, leaving behind a pristine white landscape that made everything look soft and peaceful. I found myself spending more truly looking out instead of just staring, noticing small details I'd missed in my months of. I started eating regular meals, not because food had regained, but because I felt obligated to the body that had carried me through 87 years of life. I began taking my medications on schedule, accepting visits from the physical therapist, and making small talk with the nursing staff. I wasn't happy. Happiness still felt like a foreign concept. But I was functioning, which was more than I'd managed in months. On Wednesday afternoon, Dr. Hamilton made weekly rounds. He seemed surprised to find me sitting up in bed, fully dressed, with my hair combed and my Bible open in my lap. "Well, Mrs. Thompson," he said, checking his chart, "you're looking much better today. The staff tells me you've been eating more, participating in your care again. How are you feeling?" "Tired," answered honestly, "but not gone, if that makes sense." He nodded, making notes. Depression can be just as serious as any physical illness, especially social isolation, grief, challenges of aging. They all take a real toll. I'm glad to see you're taking steps to re-engage. After he left, I thought about his words. What exactly was my situation? I was an elderly woman in a nursing home, largely forgotten by her family, facing an uncertain future, declining health and dwindling resources. But I was also a former teacher who had shaped young minds for 4 decades. I was a widow who had been deeply loved by a good. I was a mother who had raised 3 children to adulthood, grown away from me. I was a woman who had lived through decades of, who had stories and wisdom and that someone might value. Less than I'd been allowing myself. That evening, after the dinner church and the hall lights had been dimmed for the night, I sat by my window watching the maple trees, its bare branches reaching upward. Like I couldn't tell, thinking about Mrs. Patterson's, when I heard a soft knock on my late mire after the hours. I called out, "Come in," expecting to see one of the night shift nurses making their rounds. But when the door opened, no one entered. The hallway beyond was empty, dimly lit by the emergency lighting that stayed on all night. I waited, thinking perhaps someone had knocked on the wrong door, but the hallway remained silent. I was about to get up to close the door myself when I felt it, a change in the atmosphere of the room, not a physical change that made I looked around but everything exactly as it had moment. The institutional furniture, the ugly yellow walls, the smell of disinfectant with old age. Nothing had, and yet everything felt different. It was then that I saw him. He didn't appear dramatically, with bright lights or heavenly music or any of the theatrical elements I might have expected from years of Sunday school. Instead, he was simply there, sitting in the uncomfortable chair beside my bed, as if he'd been there all along, and I was exactly as I'd always imagined him, but also completely different. He was ordinary and extraordinary, a thing so that my heart, even as my mind struggled to process what he didn't speak at first. He just sat there, looking at me with an expression that I felt suddenly not judged, not pitied, not analyzed, in all my brokenness and sorrow and desperate longing to matter to someone. The tears came then, not the tears of self-pity, but something deep. I wept like I'd been lost, and his fine, like a woman who has been for months, explained what I was my lack of faith, my despair, my inability to find wasn't audible if he were speaking to my soul. Nothing to apologize for, Margaret. I've been here with you through it all. I sobbed. So forgotten, useless, alone but not abandoned, forgotten by some but not by me. He leaned forward then, and although he didn't, I felt surrounded by a warmth. It was the warm, absolute being loved, not for what I could do, fighting their own battles. Their silence doesn't mean you, and struggling with being in death and loss. Because love makes us vulnerable, because care, that vulnerable hurt, it's also what makes you. I looked into it, eyes that held death, eyes that had seen those love over judging I hadn't felt in longer than I who loved me. Live each, love the people. Every chapter has, even the ones in silence. He and I, as the hours passed unmarked by clocks or schedule. I felt peace so long. Hope taking seemed too barren to lighten the sky. He placed his hand over my heart, not physically, but spiritually. Felt something that would grow and bloom in whatever time I had remained. Remember, you are beloved always. When I next opened my eyes, I was alone in my room again. The morning light was streaming through my window, and I could hear the familiar sounds of breakfast prepared down the hall. But everything was different now. I was different now. I had been visited by love itself, and that love had changed at the cellular level, transforming despair, meaningless purpose, abandonment, abiding sense of belonging. I woke that morning with a lightness I hadn't felt in years. The room looked exactly the same beige walls, same institutional furniture, same view of the parking lot and the skeletal maple. I saw it all with new eyes. Where before I had seen, I now saw a temporary stopping place on a longer journey. Where before I had felt forgotten, I now felt held in a love so vast and that human forgetfulness seemed like nothing more than a mind. Maria arrived for morning care and stopped short in the doorway, her eyes widening in surprise. "Miss Maggie, you look different today. Did you sleep well?" I smiled. Actually smiled, feeling the unfamiliar pull of muscles I hadn't used in months. "I slept very well, thank you. And I think I'd like to get dressed in something colorful today. Maybe that blue sweater with the flowers on it." Clearly delighted by this as she helped me dress, chattering about the way the sunlight was making the snow sparkle like diamonds, found myself really listening to her voice, hearing the genuine warm caring that had always been there but that I'd been too wrapped up in my own misery to. "Maria," I said as she was brushing my hair, "I want you to know how grateful I am for your goodness. You've been taking care of me all this time, even when I wasn't very good company." For a moment, and she spoke. Her voice was, "Miss Maggie, you remind me of my grandmother back in to tell me stories about when she was young, about the old days, more of your story. Time in months, memories that had been locked away. I wanted to talk about Harold and about teaching, about raising 3 children and watching them grow into adults. These weren't just painful reminders of better times, they were treasures. Gifts that I could give to people, meaning in them." After Maria left, I made my way to the dining room for breakfast. Several residents looked up in surprise as I entered. Hadn't been to breakfast in weeks, preferring to have meals brought to my room where I could eat in solitude or, more often, not eat at all. "Maggie," called Mrs. Patterson from the table. "Come sit with us. We were just talking about the snow. Isn't it beautiful?" I joined her and Mrs. Chen and Mr. Johnson, accepting their welcomes with a warmth that surprised us all. The conversation flowed easily, comments about the weather, updates on grandchildren's activities, gentle complaints about the coffee quality. But underneath the ordinary chatter, I sensed something deeper, the profound for connection, for the simple acknowledgement of each other's existence. "You know," I said during a lull in conversation, "I used to teach high school English, and every October I'd have my students write essays about what they were grateful for. Always dreaded grading them because so superficial. Grateful for cars and phones, but once in a while, a student would write something that would break my heart open, about being grateful for a parent who worked 2 jobs to keep food on the table, or for a teacher who believed in them when no one else did, or for small moments of this that kept them going." The others' list. Chen nodded. "My grandson wrote something like that once, about being grateful for his grandfather's hand. They showed him how to build things and fix things and create things. Such wisdom in young people sometimes. Maybe we could do that," suggested Mr. Johnson shyly. "Write gratitude essay, what we come up with at our age." A small revolution that rippled outward from that breakfast over the following days. Found myself engaging with life in ways I'd thought were lost to me forever. Attending activities again, not just to pass time, but of people who shared this final I began reading to some of the revision problems. Discovering still strong, I started a small writing group, helping them find words for experiences that had shaped their lives. I even convinced Rebecca, the activities director, to let me teach a weekly class on literature, discussing short stories and poems that spoke to the experiences of aging and loss and unexpected grace. Most importantly, I began to see my fellow residents not as fellow prisoners, but as people with rich histories, complex emotions, and ongoing stories, and honored. Mrs. Chen had been a task who had clothed her 6 children through decades of economic Mr. Johnson had served in the Korean War and still wrote letters to the families of men who hadn't made it home. Mrs. Patterson had been married to the 3 years and still wore her wedding ring, turning it on her finger when she talked about missing him. We were all wrestling with the challenge of finding meaning in our final chapters, all longing to be and valued who we were rather than dismissed as irrelevant relics of bygone eras. In connecting with their story, I began to rediscover the value of my own. 3 weeks after my miraculous night, I was sitting by my window grading essays from my writing group when my phone rang. The sound I'd grown so accustomed. "Hello?" "Mom," David's voice, uncertain and worried. "Mom, I just got a call from the nurse. Differently, more active. I was calling to check." Now he calls. Anger dissolved quick, replaced by something soft, complex. I thought about Jesus' words about my sharing their own burden, fighting their own battles. "I'm doing better, sweetheart." And meant it. "Much better, actually. How are you? How are Jennifer and the kids?" We talked for 20 minutes. Really talked, not the stilted, guilty conversations we'd had in the past. He told me about his job stress, about worries over his teenage daughter's choices, about the balancing work, and his own. I listened without offering. The wisdom of experience seemed welcome. "Mom," he said before we hung up, "I'm sorry I haven't called more often. I should, but then time would pass, and I'd feel guilty about not calling, or to call, and I don't know. I was being stupid. You were being. We all do the best we can with what we have. I love you, Dave. I've always lived." When I felt hurt, I sat holding the phone and thinking about the dramatic, once and for all kind, daily choice to release resentment, choose love instead. My children's absence had been real. The pain it caused was valid, but their absence didn't define my worth, and my pain didn't have to define my remaining years. Over the following weeks, Susan called twice and even visited once, bringing photos of her teenagers and updates on neighborhood news. Michael sent a long email with pictures of his new apartment in Phoenix, along with an apology for his silence and a promise to do better at staying in touch. The relationships were still tentative, still healing, but they were relationships again instead of wounds. But more importantly, I had learned to find me and connection beyond my biological family. I had discovered a chosen family here at Suns, people who knew my daily struggles, who valued my contributions, who saw me as I was now, rather than mourning who I used to be. The maple tree outside my signs of spring. Tiny green buds appearing seemed dead just before. Those buds with one, marveling at its willingness to invest in new growth despite had stripped me down old and darkness, now ready to blend in whatever. That night, I opened my Bible to the psalm that had spoken to me, when my father and my mother forsake me, then the Lord will take. But now I read further, to verses I had missed in my teach me your way, oh, unless I had believed to see the goodness of the Lord in the I was still living, still breathing, capable of love and want. My story wasn't over. In fact, as I prepared for sleep, I whispered excuse, but for the grace, for the strength to love even has value that transcends human understanding. I was 87 years old, living in a nursing home, with a body that was failing and a future that was uncertain. But I was also beloved, purposeful, and surrounded by opportunities to and receive love. I had learned that being forgotten by some people didn't mean being forgotten by the one who matters most, and that sometimes our greatest growth comes not from our victory, but from learning to find grace in our. The maple tree rustled softly outside my window. I fell asleep, knowing that tomorrow would bring new opportunity to serve, to matter in ways of what I'd experienced during those dark months, or the miracle that had lifted me. But that was okay. Some stories are too large for words, some transformations too subtle for outside eyes to fully comprehend. What mattered was that I had been found when I was lost, loved when I felt unlovable, and given hope when hope seemed impossible. What mattered was that I was still here, still breathing, capable of blessing the world with whatever, and that I knew was more than enough. Dear listeners, we hope Margaret's story touched your heart. If you'd like to keep experiencing powerful stories, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and tell us in the comments which part moved you the most. Every day we share stories, the depth of life and human heart. We'll be waiting for you in the comments.